4 years after I'd buried my daughter, her old disconnected phone rang in my quiet house. The screen read "0", but I knew that chilling, small voice. 4 years. 4 years is a long time. It's long enough for the seasons to turn 16 times, for the world to keep spinning on its axis, as if it hadn't been knocked clean off of yours. It's long enough for the searing, white-hot pain of grief to cool into a dull, permanent ache in your bones. It's a phantom limb. You know it's gone, but you still feel it, especially when the weather changes or a song comes on the radio. For me, that phantom limb was shaped exactly like my 7-year-old daughter, Lily. My fiancé, Mark, says I'm the strongest person he knows. He didn't know me before. He didn't know the me who could laugh without a shadow of guilt in her eyes. The me who believed the universe was a fundamentally kind place. He only knows this version. The carefully reconstructed woman who schedules her life with rigid precision because spontaneity feels dangerous. He proposed 6 months ago with a simple, elegant ring that felt impossibly heavy on my finger. He's a good man. He's patient, he's kind, and he never pushes when he sees the ghost of Lily in my gaze. He just gently takes my hand, grounding me in the now. We were planning a wedding for the spring, a small affair, new beginnings, and all that. I was trying, I really was. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I talked about floral arrangements and guest lists. I was building a new life on the foundations of the old one, but the crawl space beneath was haunted. Every night before I went to bed, I had a ritual. In the bottom drawer of my nightstand, nestled in a velvet bag, was Lily's old phone. It was a cheap pink smartphone we'd gotten her for her 7th birthday, mostly for playing games and calling me if she was ever at a friend's house. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. The service was cancelled, of course, but it still held her pictures. Her silly selfies with the dog filter, videos of her singing off-key to some cartoon theme song. The last text I ever got from her. A string of heart and flower emojis. It was a digital mausoleum, a tiny 4-inch pocket of who she was. Every night I'd take it out, plug it in, and let it charge. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid that if the battery died, she'd die all over again. Tonight was no different. Mark was out with friends, a rare boys' night, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle patter of rain against the window. I had just finished the dishes, the warm water a comfort on my skin. I dried my hands, walked into the bedroom, and performed my ritual. I pulled the small phone from its velvet sheath. The screen protector was cracked in the corner from a fall she'd taken weeks before she got sick. I ran my thumb over it. The memory so sharp it was like a physical sting. Then, I plugged in the charger. The screen lit up, showing her favourite picture of our golden retriever, Barnaby, as the wallpaper. A little battery icon appeared, filling with green. I set it on the nightstand and was about to turn away when the impossible happened. The phone vibrated, and then it rang. My blood turned to ice water. It wasn't a notification chime or an alarm. It was a full, shrill ringtone, the one she'd picked herself. A tinny, synthesized version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. A sound I hadn't heard in 4 years, a sound I thought was locked away in the phone's dead memory, inaccessible without a SIM card or a Wi-Fi connection. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the screen, which was now flashing with an incoming call. The display just read, unknown number. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. It had to be a glitch, a freak software error. Maybe connecting it to the charger had triggered some old cached notification. That had to be it. Phones do weird things. But it kept ringing. A persistent, tinny lullaby that was starting to sound like a scream. My hand trembled as I reached for it. Part of me wanted to throw it against the wall, to smash the source of that terrible, memory-laden sound. But another part, a desperate mother's part that never truly dies, needed to know. I swiped the green icon. I put the phone to my ear. My breath caught in my throat. At first, there was only static. A crackling, empty sound, like a radio station lost between frequencies. I almost hung up, almost laughed at myself for my ridiculous, grief-stricken panic. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. The static hissed back. I was about to pull the phone away to chalk it all up to a broken piece of technology when a voice cut through the noise. It was small, faint. So faint it was almost a whisper on the wind, but I knew it. I would know that voice in a cacophony of a million others. It was the voice that had haunted my dreams for 1,460 nights. "Mummy?" The world tilted on its axis. Every ounce of air was sucked from my lungs. It was her. It was Lily. It sounded just like her, but thin, ethereal, and there was a chattering sound behind her words, like the clacking of teeth. "Lily?" I choked out, tears instantly blurring my vision. "Lily, baby, is that you?" The static swelled for a moment, and then her voice came through again, a little clearer this time, a little more desperate. It was laced with a shivering tremor that I remembered all too well from her last few days, when the fever wouldn't break and she was racked with chills no blanket could warm. "Mom," the voice whispered, the sound crackling with cold and distance. "I'm so cold." The world dissolved into a roaring in my ears. For a second, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The only reality was that tiny shivering voice, a ghost made of static and memory. My own voice was a mangled thing, a sound torn from the deepest part of my soul. "Lily? Baby? Where are you? Talk to Mommy! Where are you?" I was on my knees, the cold hardwood floor pressing into my skin, but I didn't feel it. I was clutching the small pink phone to my ear so tightly my knuckles were white, as if I could physically hold onto her voice, keep it from slipping away. Quote, 9, she stammered, her words punctuated by that awful, chattering sound. Quote, 10. Quote, age 11. My questions were frantic, nonsensical. I was talking to my daughter, who had died of leukemia 4 years ago. I was asking her if she was lost. My mind was a broken compass, spinning wildly, trying to find a direction in a world that no longer had one. The rational part of my brain, a tiny, screaming voice in the back of my head, was telling me this was a hallucination, a psychotic break brought on by stress and grief. But my heart, the big, stupid, broken muscle in my chest, knew. It knew that voice. It knew that shiver. She whispered, her voice fading slightly into the static. Jen, I pleaded, tears streaming down my face, dripping from my chin onto the phone. Shut, 15, shut. The static crackled loudly, obscuring her voice. I could hear something faint behind it, a tinny, repetitive melody. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Lily, can you hear me?" I shouted into the phone, my voice cracking. "I'm coming to get you. Just tell me where you are." There was a long moment of just hissing static, an eternity where I thought I'd lost her. My hope, which had flared up like a magnesium strip, blindingly bright and impossibly hot, was just as quickly turning to ash. Then, one last, chilling phrase pierced through the noise, as clear as if she was standing right behind me. And then the line went dead. Not a click, not a beep, just silence. The screen of the phone went black. I jabbed at the power button, the home button, anything, nothing. It was as dead as it had been 5 minutes ago. I frantically tried to turn it back on, my fingers slipping on the screen. It was useless. The phone was a brick again. The call was gone. I looked at the call log. It was empty. There was no record of an, quote, 19 students, no evidence that anything had happened at all. It was as if the last 2 minutes had been completely erased from existence. I don't know how long I knelt there on the floor, clutching the dead phone, my body shaking with violent, silent sobs. The sound of a key in the front door lock was what finally broke the spell. It was Mark. He walked in, shaking the rain from his coat, a cheerful smile on his face that died the second he saw me. Quote to Hikanjin Nasa. He asked, rushing to my side, his voice thick with concern. He knelt in front of me, his hands hovering over my shoulders as if he was afraid I might shatter. How could I even begin to explain? The words felt like stones in my throat. Quote to Jakul. I finally managed to whisper, my voice raw. Quote, 22. I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. I just held up the small pink phone. Mark's expression softened with a sad understanding. He thought I was just having a bad night, a wave of grief that had knocked me off my feet. Quote, 23, he said gently, trying to take the phone from my hands. I said, my voice suddenly sharp, angry. I pulled the phone closer to my chest. Quote, 26, he stared at me. The concern in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a different kind of fear. The kind of fear you have for someone's sanity. Quote, 27. Quote, Kate. I cried, finally looking at him, my eyes pleading with him to believe me. Quote, 29. Mark's face was a mask of gentle pity. He reached out and stroked my hair. His touch meant to soothe, but it felt condescending. Quote to it, Quote to it, sex, at sunch. I insisted, scrambling to my feet. Why, quote to bide it, I do he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture as he stood up with me. You. Quote Garcia and ups. His logical, rational explanations felt like daggers. He was trying to wrap my nightmare in a neat little box of reason, but he couldn't, because he didn't know. He hadn't heard what I'd heard. I stood there, shaking my head, trying to make him understand, when a cold spike of memory shot through me. The sound, the faint, tinny melody behind the static when she said she heard singing. It wasn't just a random tune. My blood ran cold as I finally placed it. It was the melody from her little ballerina music box, the one she loved more than any other toy, the one that played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the one we buried with her. A gasp escaped my lips, sharp and ragged. Mark's words faded into a meaningless buzz. The music box. I could hear the melody perfectly in my head now. The slightly off-key plinking notes that had been the soundtrack to so many of Lily's tea parties and bedtime stories. It was a cheap thing, a little wooden box with a spinning ballerina whose pink tutu was slightly frayed, but it was her treasure. When she got sick, she'd clutch it in her tiny hands, the music a fragile shield against the beeping machines and the hushed, worried voices of the doctors. In her last lucid moments, she'd made me promise. Put her in with me, Mommy, she had whispered, her breath shallow, so she can dance for me when I'm sleeping. And I had. Against the quiet objections of the funeral director, who probably thought it was morbid, I had tucked the small wooden box into the crook of her arm, nestled beside her favourite teddy bear. I had closed the lid myself, sealing her away with her ballerina dancer and a piece of my own soul. The memory was so vivid, so brutal that my knees buckled. Mark caught me, his arms a firm anchor in the storm that was ripping me apart. Anna, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. I have, I breathed, my eyes wide and locked on some distant point in the room. The singing she heard, Mark, it was her music box, her ballerina. We buried it with her. Mark's face went pale. He gently guided me to the edge of the bed and sat me down. He knelt before me, taking both of my hands in his. They were warm and solid, a stark contrast to the icy dread flooding my veins. Anna, he said, his voice low and firm, trying to cut through my panic. Listen to me. This is grief. It's a powerful, ugly thing. It's twisting your memories, making connections that aren't there. You heard a voice, you got scared, and your mind filled in the blanks with the most painful details it could find. That's all this is. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him more than anything. I wanted to wake up tomorrow and dismiss this as a horrible dream, a stress-induced nightmare. But the cold certainty that had settled in my gut was immovable. You didn't hear her, Mark. I whispered, pulling my hands away. You didn't hear how scared she was, how cold she sounded. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. Okay. What do you want to do? The question hung in the air between us. What could I do? Call the police? Tell them I'd gotten a phone call from my dead daughter? They'd send a social worker, not a detective. Tell my therapist? She'd up my medication and schedule twice-weekly sessions. No one would believe me. Everyone would look at me with that same gentle, pitying expression Mark wore now. The look you give a fragile thing you're afraid might break. I said, the words tasting like ash. I snapped, the frustration and fear boiling over into anger. Quote, check. We argued for nearly an hour. He used logic, reason, and gentle pleading. I countered with the raw, undeniable conviction of a mother. In the end, he knew it was a losing battle. He saw the wild, haunted look in my eyes and understood that I would go with or without him. Defeated, he grabbed our raincoats. The drive to Oakwood Cemetery was silent and tense. The rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers keeping a frantic, rhythmic beat against the oppressive quiet inside the car. The world outside the windows was a blur of slick asphalt and distorted streetlights. Each mile closer felt like a mile deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The cemetery gates were closed, of course. Mark parked the car by the curb, the engine idling. Anna, please, let's just go home. We can come back in the morning. But I was already out of the car, the cold rain soaking my hair instantly. The ornate iron gates were tall, but there was a section of the stone wall a few yards down that was lower, crumbling slightly with age. Without a second thought, I started climbing. Anna, for God's sake, you're going to get hurt, Mark called, but his words were swallowed by the wind. I scrambled over the top, my jeans snagging on a loose piece of stone, and dropped down onto the soft, wet grass on the other side. My sneakers squelched in the mud. Mark, with another heavy sigh, followed me. He was more agile, clearing the wall with an athletic grace that seemed out of place in this city of the dead. He didn't speak, just took out his phone and turned on the flashlight. Its powerful beam cutting a stark white path through the darkness. We walked in silence, past rows of stone angels weeping in the rain and granite obelisks pointing like accusing fingers at the bruised, starless sky. I knew the way by heart. Section C, row 12, plot 4. I could have walked it blindfolded. When the flashlight beam finally fell upon the small, simple headstone, I stopped. It was polished marble, engraved with her name, the dates that marked her impossibly short life, and a single carved lily. The words felt like a mockery now. Quote 53. Mark said softly, his voice full of relief. Quote, he was right. Nothing looked out of place. The small patch of grass was neat. The flowers I'd left last week were wilted, but still in their vase. It was peaceful, terribly, finally peaceful. A wave of doubt washed over me. Had he been right? Was I losing my mind? Had I dragged him out here on a cold, rainy night because of a grief-induced hallucination? Shame and exhaustion began to creep in, chilling me more than the rain. I turned to leave, ready to apologize, to let him guide me back to the warmth of the car and the sanity of our life. But as I turned, Mark's flashlight beam slid off the headstone and caught something on the ground just behind it. It was a flash of colour against the dark, sodden earth. Mud, lots of it, and something else, something small and pink. Mark, what is that? I whispered, my voice trembling. He moved the beam back, focusing it on the spot. My heart stopped. There, half buried in the mud behind Lily's headstone, was a small, child-sized footprint. And lying beside it, caked in dirt but unmistakably familiar, was the matching pink smartphone case that belonged to Lily's phone, the one I had taken off and put in a memory box years ago, the one that was supposed to be safe in a drawer at home. And then the beam moved slightly higher, catching the edge of the grass, the neatly cut sod around the grave. It wasn't as neat as I first thought. On the side, hidden from the path, the earth was soft, disturbed, and mounded up, as if someone had been digging. And digging, recently. That single, muddy footprint was a scream in the silence of the graveyard. It was small, impossibly small, and my mind refused to process it. Beside it, the dirty pink phone case seemed to glow under the flashlight beam, an artifact from a different dimension. Mark swore under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound of disbelief. He took a step forward, his own feet sinking slightly into the soft earth, and crouched down, shining the light directly on the disturbed ground. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier condescension. Now, it was tight with a fear that mirrored my own. "Someone's been digging." He was right. It wasn't the work of a groundskeeper. This was messy, frantic. Clumps of sod were tossed aside, and the earth beneath was a darker, wetter shade of brown. It was as if someone had started to excavate the grave and then, for whatever reason, had stopped. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea. Who would do this? Who would desecrate a child's grave? Was this some kind of sick prank? Was that what the phone call was? An elaborate, monstrously cruel hoax? My eyes darted from the disturbed earth to the muddy footprint, then to the phone case. My brain was a whirlwind of impossible theories. I stammered, pointing with a trembling finger. Mark didn't have an answer. He just stood up slowly, his face grim, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness, as if he expected to see a figure lurking behind a nearby headstone. The rain had softened to a fine mist, clinging to us, chilling us to the bone. The cemetery, which had seemed peacefully melancholic moments before, now felt actively hostile. Every shadow seemed to move, every drip of water from a tree branch sounded like a footstep. "We're calling the police," Mark said, his voice firm, resolute. He pulled out his own phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "And tell them what?" I asked, a hysterical laugh bubbling in my throat. "That my dead daughter called me? That someone left her phone case and a muddy footprint by her grave? They'll think we're crazy, Mark. Or worse, they'll think we did this." He hesitated, his jaw tight. He knew I was right. It sounded insane. A grieving mother and her fiancé trespassing in a cemetery in the middle of the night, claiming to have found what, exactly? Proof of a ghost? Evidence of a crime that made no logical sense? They'd separate us, question us. They'd see the dirt on my shoes, the wild look in my eyes, and their suspicion would land squarely on me. "Then, what do you suggest we do, Anna?" he asked, his voice raw with frustration. "We can't just leave this. We can't pretend we didn't see it." I stared at the disturbed earth, at that small muddy grave. An idea, cold and terrible, began to form in my mind. It was an unthinkable thought, a violation of everything sacred. But the voice on the phone. "Hurry, Mummy. It's so cold. So cold." It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a plea. I whispered. Mark asked, though I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what I meant. He recoiled as if I'd suggested murder. I said, my voice gaining a desperate strength. He hissed, grabbing my arm. "Watch. 70. 71. I shot back, wrenching my arm free. 72. The thought, once spoken, took root in my mind like a cancer. What if the call wasn't supernatural? What if it was something far, far worse? Grave robbers? It made no sense. There was nothing of value buried with her, just a teddy bear and a cheap music box. A cult? A medical experiment? My mind spun with grotesque possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. But they were all preferable to the alternative. Preferable to the idea that Lily herself was somehow trapped, cold and alone, somewhere in the dark. Before Mark could stop me, I dropped to my knees beside the grave. The earth was soft, just as I'd thought. Almost muddy, I clawed at it with my bare hands, the cold, wet soil packing under my fingernails. It was slow, messy work. Tears of grief and rage streamed down my face, mixing with the rain and the dirt. "Anna, stop! Stop it!" Mark pleaded, trying to pull me up, but I was fueled by a primal, adrenaline-soaked terror. I wouldn't be moved. I dug and scraped, my hands raw, my mind focused on one single, terrible goal. Seeing my desperation, seeing that I was utterly beyond reason, Mark let out a choked sound of defeat. He looked around wildly, then his flashlight beam landed on a small, decorative spade someone had left leaning against a nearby family plot, probably after planting flowers. He grabbed it. Quote 74, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and reluctant resolve. Quote, so he plunged the small spade into the softened earth. It was horrifyingly easy. The dirt gave way with wet, sucking sounds. We worked in a frantic, silent frenzy, the only sounds our ragged breaths, the squelch of the shovel, and the relentless patter of the rain. We weren't digging a neat, rectangular hole. We were just digging, trying to get down, trying to find an answer. It felt like hours, but it could only have been minutes. My hands were scraped and bleeding. My muscles screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then, Mark's shovel hit something hard with a dull, hollow thud. We both froze. The sound echoed in the damp night air, a sound of absolute finality. He had hit the coffin, or what was supposed to be the coffin. Mark dropped the spade and fell to his knees beside me. Together, with trembling, muddy hands, we scraped away the last few inches of dirt, revealing a patch of the small white casket we had chosen for her. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me sick, washed over me. It was there. She was there. This was all just a terrible, insane misunderstanding. Quote, 76. Mark breathed, his shoulders slumping. 77. But I couldn't. Something was still wrong. My fingers traced the exposed surface of the lid, and then I felt it, near the edge of the section we'd uncovered. A series of deep, long scratches in the wood. They weren't from the shovel. They were too deliberate, too patterned, and they were on the inside. It looked like someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way out. My breath hitched in my throat. My fingers, numb with cold and caked in mud, traced the deep gouges in the wood. They were unmistakable. Long, frantic lines, splintering the pristine white finish. A primal scream built in my chest, a denial of what my own senses were telling me. It was impossible. Utterly, fundamentally impossible. Mark saw it at the same time. The beam of his flashlight trembled, casting dancing shadows over the horrific marks. He didn't speak. There were no words left. The neat little boxes of logic and reason he had tried to build around this nightmare had been shattered. Quote, 78, I whispered, the words barely audible over the hammering of my own heart. Kurt. 79. He started, his voice a strained plea. Joseph, I shrieked, the sound tearing through the quiet cemetery. All the grief, all the fear, all the madness of the past few hours coalesced into a single, unmovable point of conviction. I started clawing at the earth around the lid, trying to get to the latches I knew were there. This was no longer about a phone call or a footprint. This was about those marks. Those terrifying, impossible marks. Seeing my crazed determination, Mark seemed to cross a threshold. The fight went out of him, replaced by a grim, shared madness. We were in this together now, drowning in the same impossible sea. He picked up the spade again, not to dig, but to use as a lever. He jammed the metal edge into the seam between the lid and the base of the small casket. He put his shoulder into it and pushed. The wet wood groaned in protest. I threw my own weight against it, my muddy hand slipping on the slick surface. There was a sickening crack, and then a splintering pop as the first latch gave way. A smell wafted out, Not the smell of decay I had been subconsciously bracing myself for. It was the scent of damp earth, of mildew, and something else, something faintly metallic and sterile, like a hospital room. Encouraged, terrified, we worked our way to the other side. With another heave and another gut-wrenching, splintering sound, the lid gave way completely. Mark pushed it aside, and it fell onto the muddy grass with a heavy thud. He shone the flashlight into the opening. And we saw. The coffin was empty. The relief I expected to feel was absent. In its place was a new, more profound horror. The white satin lining was torn to shreds, stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. Lily's teddy bear was there, its button eyes staring up at the rainy sky, one of its fabric arms ripped nearly off. And, in the corner, nestled in a tangle of ruined satin, was the little ballerina music box. Its lid was open. And on the inside of the casket's lid, the part that had been inches from her face, were more of those scratches. Dozens of them, frantic, desperate, and among them, scratched into the wood with what could only have been a fingernail, was a single, shakily carved word. Quote, 81 quote. I collapsed backward, landing hard in the mud. The world was tilting, spinning, the rain on my face feeling like 1,000 icy needles. It wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a hallucination. My daughter had woken up. She had woken up buried alive, in the dark, and had tried to claw her way out. The thought was so monstrous, so far beyond the realm of comprehension, that my mind simply shut down. I was vaguely aware of Mark grabbing my shoulders, shaking me, his voice a distant roar. That's when we heard the siren. A single, piercing wail, growing closer. Someone must have seen our lights, heard my scream. A groundskeeper, a neighbour, it didn't matter. Flashing blue and red lights cut through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. Mark yelled, pulling me to my feet. But I was a dead weight. My eyes were glued to that empty, violated box. My baby, my poor baby. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the night. The tinny, synthesized melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It wasn't coming from the music box in the grave. It was coming from my pocket. I fumbled for the pink phone, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The screen was lit up. It was another call. Unknown number. With a choked sob I answered it, putting it on speaker. Mummy? Lily's voice whispered, but this time it was different. It wasn't crackling with static. It was crystal clear, and it wasn't coming from the phone's speaker. It was coming from behind us. We both spun around. There, standing at the edge of the flashlight's beam, silhouetted against the flashing police lights, was a small figure. A little girl in a dirty, torn white dress. The one she was buried in. Her feet were bare and caked in mud. Her hair was matted with dirt. She was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. And in her hand, she was holding a newer, sleeker smartphone, not the pink one I held. Quoted, negate your fire. I breathed, my heart ceasing to beat. Before I could take a step, a man burst through the trees. He was frantic, his face pale with panic. He rushed to the little girl's side, wrapping her in a huge coat. He looked at us, at the open grave, at the phone in my hand, and his eyes filled with a horrified understanding. You must be Anna, he said, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that was no less horrifying, but infinitely more human. The little girl, Lila, looked up at me, her eyes wide with a child's simple fear. I was playing hide and seek, she whispered. I hid in the broken house, and I found her phone. It was ringing. The mausoleum, the man said, pointing a shaking finger towards a large stone structure a few plots away. The door is broken. The kids dare each other to go in there. She must have found it. He looked at the open grave. Last week, there was a landslide. The hill back there gave way in a storm. It must have shifted the earth, exposed part of the... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The landslide had unearthed her coffin. Someone, maybe kids looking for trouble, had found it, pried it open, and in their ghoulish discovery had taken the only thing of any perceived value, her old phone. They must have charged it, somehow gotten it to work, and then, in an act of supreme cruelty, started calling the only number in its contact list, Mummy. They had used an AI voice cloner, just as Mark had suggested. They had taken her voice from the videos I'd posted on social media years ago. The singing Lila heard was them, playing a recording of the music box to torment me further. The footprint, the phone case, it was all part of their sick, elaborate game. They had left clues, wanting to be discovered, wanting to maximize the pain. They probably reburied the coffin poorly, leaving the ground soft. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a miracle. It was just cruelty. The raw, senseless cruelty of bored teenagers. As the police officers approached, their faces grim, Mark began explaining, his voice steady now, piecing together the logical, terrible truth. I barely heard him. I was looking at Lila, shivering in her father's arms. I walked over to her, my legs unsteady. I knelt down in the mud right in front of her. Still. You were very brave to answer the phone, I said, my voice thick with tears. Thank you. She just stared at me, her big eyes reflecting the flashing lights. I reached out and gently brushed a muddy leaf from her hair. She wasn't my daughter, but she was a daughter. And she was cold, and she was safe. The resolution wasn't satisfying in the way a happy ending is. The teenagers were caught, their pathetic confessions a footnote to my agony. There was no miraculous return, no reunion beyond the veil. But there was an answer. The monster wasn't supernatural, it was human. And in a strange, painful way, that was a resolution I could live with. The haunting question of, quote, 97, quote, was replaced by the solid, brutal truth. My daughter hadn't woken up in a coffin. She hadn't suffered that unimaginable horror. She had rested peacefully until the world outside disturbed her. We reburied her the next day in a new coffin, in a more secure plot. As we stood there, under a pale, watery sun, I took Lily's old pink phone from my pocket. I held it for a long moment, then I knelt and placed it in the fresh earth, burying it with her for the final time. It was time for both of us to stop answering the call of the past. It was time to finally let her and myself rest in peace.